Sometimes I'm amazed at how fortunate I am to be able to fish these cool places. Um, I This last weekend was awesome. I don't chase carp on a dry very often, but I went up to the Bear River. Um, and the Bear River's actually been a little bit higher this year than I've seen it in several years, and I think part of that has been because water management in Utah, they're trying to get a little bit more of the water out into the Great Salt Lakes. So basically, the Bear River at Cutler Dam gets diverted into two canals that kind of go north of the river and south of the river. Almost all that water is used for agricultural irrigation. Very little of it ever actually ends up into the Great Salt Lake. And that's really the last dam before the Bear River gets to the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge. And from there, some of that ends up out into the Great Salt Lake. But they keep the bird refuge fairly full for the birds, and very little water from there ends up going out into the Great Salt Lake. So it's been pretty high this year, higher and murkier than I've seen it in years past, at this time of year for sure. And I went there one time earlier this year, and it was good fishing, but I was a little surprised that it was higher. And then, it's been a couple months, and this weekend I decided to run back up there and check it out. And it's still a little high, but the fishing was fantastic. 90% dry fly. So let me dive into that. Let's talk about dry fly fishing for carp and what I'm doing here. So first of all, let me kind of go over my setup. So when I'm dry fly fishing for carp, I'm usually throwing small flies. Now, occasionally you can get them to eat hoppers and beetle patterns and things like that. Beetles patterns are actually quite effective. Hoppers less so. I've seen them hit them, and I know they hit cicadas in different areas and stuff like that. And there were hoppers everywhere on this river. But they just don't seem to hit them. Now, whether it's because they can see them better or what, I don't know, but struggle to get them to hit something big like that. So the pattern that I used on this particular trip, almost exclusively, was just a size 14 or size 16 parachute Adams. And I actually ended up going up there 2 days. First day I went, I crushed it. I probably landed 30 plus fish to the net. And that includes 7 or 8 where I completely bent the hook out and lost them on my parachute Adams that were tied on just standard nymph hooks. So I actually went and got some of my carp hooks, which are even heavier. That night I tied more up, and then I took my wife back up to do some more. So first thing is fly pattern. They eat just like trout do. They're going to eat damselflies, and they're going to eat mayflies, and they're going to eat caddises and all those things that are on the water. Trout are more selective in that they a lot of times will focus on one particular type of food, right? So if there's a blueing olive hatch, the trout are going to just eat the blueing olive sometimes and ignore everything else, anything else that hatches sometimes. They could have salmon flies and, stone flies and caddises come by, and they'll ignore them because they're focused in on that one food source. Carp are not that way at all. Carp are opportunistic feeders. So they can be out in these scum lines, and they'll eat a beetle, then they'll eat a mayfly, then they'll eat a caddis, then they'll eat a hopper, then they'll eat a caddis, then they'll eat a mayfly, then they'll eat what looks like a bunch of moss, but usually because there's a bunch of bugs in it, a ball of midges. They are going to eat any food source they see when they're actively feeding. So as long as the pattern you throw to them resembles something that they would typically eat, they're going to probably hit it. Now, you'll hear sometimes people say, like, well, I've seen someone throw a cigarette butt and the carp ate it. I'm like, I've seen someone throw a cigarette butt and a trout ate it. Stuff happens. Sometimes they're going to eat something or go up and taste something because they think, oh, what is that? Is that a food source? If it's not, they'll spit it out. And you'll see that with the fly, too. They're not going to hang on to it very long. It's usually suck it in. You might see them, mouth it once, and then they're going to spit it out. Now, carp feed by sucking. Okay, so when they come up and they suck a fly, it's different than a trout suck. A trout has a longer mouth. So if a big trout comes up and opens that mouth on the fly, sometimes even the surface tension of the water and the line will pull the fly out and you'll miss the fish. There's nothing you can do. This happens even more with carp because if your line is tight, even on the water, and the carp tries to suck it on the surface, one, they don't have a lot of suction right on the surface. But sometimes the fly's not going to go into their mouth, and so they end up having to suck it a couple of times. So waiting for that actually to go into their mouth is key. You'll see it in some of these videos where it seems like, I mean, they've ate a couple times. Why haven't you set the hook? Well, sometimes it's because they're eating right behind it. And sometimes it's actually because they tried to get it in their mouth, it didn't go in, and they had to try a couple of times to actually get the fly in their mouth. So you sometimes have to be a little bit more patient and let them fully eat the fly. So throw it, just about anything they're going to eat, get it in front of them without spooking them, just like all carp fly fishing, right? One of the keys is to have actively feeding fish. Well, if they're feeding on the surface, they're actively feeding. Can I get my fly to the fish without the fish knowing I'm there, right? That's the second key. So, you slap your line on the water, you throw your fly line across the carp. I mean, you're done. And that's really honestly the same for trout as well. Well, let's talk about another difference between fly fishing for trout, dry fly, versus fly fishing for carp, dry fly. Carp are extremely wary of line, even and when they're feeding on the surface. Even your monofilament or your you shouldn't really be using fluorocarbon for your leader. Talk about that more in a second though. But so you have your monofilament tapered leader. If that leader goes over the top of the carp, a lot of times that is going to spook that carp. So you can't cast out and let your fly line go over the top of that carp. Now, sometimes you can get away with it, but by and large, if you let your monofilament go over the top of an actively feeding carp, say your fly is maybe another foot past the carp, and that monofilament comes over the top of the carp, a lot of times that is going to spook that carp. You're going to line him or he's going to see it and spook. So accuracy becomes just of absolute paramount importance, and fly management. So sometimes when I cast out, maybe I'm trying to put it a foot in front of the fish and the line that they're feeding on. Sometimes I cast out and I don't make a good cast, or I cast out and there's a breeze and it pushes the fly off a foot or two. Sometimes I'm 3 feet up, but I'm like, well, that's kind of in the area. These carp, a lot of times they'll move back and forth a little bit as they're feeding. And if you're thinking, all right, I'm kind of in the ballpark, well, I'll let that fly move down. But then if that carp starts coming towards me more, and so now I'm thinking, my fly is going to actually be a foot and a half past the fish, I'm going to pull that fly over in position. I always want to err on the side of being slightly on my side of the carp with my fly. Because again, if the fly line goes over the top, or not the fly line, the monofilament goes over the top of the carp, there's a pretty good chance I'm going to spook that carp. So managing the fly that way is really important. Get it out there, pull the fly into position slightly to your side or in line. Make sure the carp gets it fully in his mouth, trout set, and enjoy the incredible fun. Some of these fights, even though I have this sped up, I think my longest fight was 8 minutes on some of these fish. Just great fun. But it is technically slightly different. Now, I will say that catching carp on the surface, actively rising, is the easiest way to fly fish for carp. Now, that's opposite from like trout, right? Dry fly is the hardest. It's the most technical. It's the most difficult. It's the most fun, but it's the most technical and it's the most difficult. With carp, this is actually the easiest way to catch carp. So for those that may be struggling to catch carp, I hope that makes you at least feel a little bit better about it, because I absolutely love fly fishing for trout. I've been doing it since I was 15 years old. Absolutely love it. It's just not nearly as difficult as it is fly fishing for carp. So hopefully those are some kind of tips that help you kind of understand how to present the fly. Okay, so let's talk real quick about leader. I'm using a 0X monofilament 12-foot leader, and then I actually put a foot to a foot and a half of fluorocarbon tippet on there. Some of you might say, well, why are you putting fluoro on it? Because fluoro sinks. And you're right, fluorocarbon absolutely sinks. But fluorocarbon is virtually invisible to the carp. So what happens when you use a little section of fluoro on the end of your monofilament leader is that section will sink just a little bit. And when it's underneath the surface, it kind of disappears. Now, it also can more easily line the carp, right? So if you use monofilament all the way to your fly, you do somewhat alleviate the chance of inadvertently lining the carp. Okay, guys, I'm actually out of time on this video. I'm going to stop right there. Hope you enjoyed it. Like and subscribe. I'm going to get the other video out to follow this up immediately.